Hi, it's Dougie Wood, and in this video I'm going to be talking to you about the SharePoint Admin Centre, how to access it, and what some of the features within the Admin Centre can do for your SharePoint environment. So the first thing to talk about is what role is going to be required in order to access the SharePoint Admin Centre. Now, the SharePoint Admin Centre will only appear for users that either have the global admin role assigned to their Microsoft 365 account or the SharePoint admin role. So if you do not see the admin option inside of the app launcher in Microsoft 365, which can also be seen on the left-hand side of the apps here, that means you do not have the SharePoint admin role or a global admin role in order to be able to access this particular admin center. If you want more information about security controls, permissions, things like that for SharePoint, I do have a separate video on my channel that's worth checking out to understand the different levels and roles required in order to access the admin centers. So let's talk about actually how to access the SharePoint Admin Center. So let's assume you do have the right level of access to go to the Admin Center, the first thing that you need to do is go to office.com, which is the homepage of Microsoft 365. From here, you should see that there's an admin button. When you click on the admin button, this is going to take you to the Admin Center of Microsoft 365. Now, to see all the different admin centers that you have access to, you can click on the Show All button on the left-hand side, and then you should see the SharePoint option down here. By clicking on that SharePoint option, that is what is going to take you to the SharePoint Admin Center and unlock all these different additional things that you can do with inside of your SharePoint environment. So the first thing to take a look at is actually the kind of home page of the Admin Center itself. You can see things like you can search the sites from here. You can see a message center, which is actually really useful for SharePoint admins because you can see upcoming new features, features which may be being sort of deprecated and taken away over a period of time, and it keeps you up to date with exactly what's going on with SharePoint Online. You can see some advisories that are reported with SharePoint, and clicking into them will give you more details about what that particular service health issue is. So you can actually take a look at what is actually impacting the SharePoint admin and SharePoint sites. You can see some high-level breakdowns of information, things like how many active sites you've got, SharePoint file activity, storage which is being used, active users within inside of SharePoint. So this is all really good metrics to kind of take a look at, especially if you've just launched SharePoint or a new SharePoint Online intranet and you're wanting to see what the uptake of this is and how much information and data is being stored within inside of SharePoint. So the next area to look at then is the active sites within inside of SharePoint. So active sites is essentially where you can see all the different SharePoint sites that have been created within your SharePoint Online environment. It's worth also mentioning that all of the SharePoint sites which get created with Microsoft Teams are also accessible in here as well. And we can see a little Teams icon that's next to it to show that actually this is owned by the group owners of this particular Microsoft team, and we know that it's been created by Microsoft Teams. We can see the site name, so actually what the site is called, the URL of the site, again, whether it's related to a Microsoft team or not, if it's got related channel sites, the overall storage which is being used by the SharePoint site, as well as who the primary admin, who should be the main contact for that site should be, what hub site it's related to. Again, what's useful about this active sites area is that it's going to list every single SharePoint site that you have within inside of your Microsoft 365 tenant, regardless of what sites it's associated to, hub sites, for example. So some people think that if they have just one hub site, they can access all the different sites from their hub site. That's not necessarily the case because not every site will be associated to a hub site. For example, the Microsoft Teams sites often aren't associated to hub sites. So this is where you can get a true view of everything which is going on inside your SharePoint sites. You can filter as well, so you can filter these down by saying things like whether they're communication sites or team sites. You can see the last activity and the date that it was created. So if you're going through a bit of a cleanse, a bit of a tidy up of your SharePoint sites, especially if you're looking at launching a new SharePoint intranet, it's quite often that you'll go in and tidy up old kind of sites. And this is a great place to say the last activity. So was this used recently or not? If it's not been touched for a few years, maybe you can look out to see, contact the primary admin and say, is this SharePoint site still required, or can we delete it and sort of clear this up. There is some other kind of information that we can get from this, so we can export this data out if we wanted to do any sort of analysis on it, or you can also choose to track this view, which essentially adds a card to your home page that shows the number of sites in this view and summarized info about them. It says if you change the view, the card updates automatically. So we can add that card, and that will then add it onto our home page of our admin center as well. Now, if any sites were ever deleted from this active sites area, they will then go into the deleted sites area. This brings me on to the next topic of how to restore a SharePoint site from the SharePoint Admin Centre. So once a site has been deleted, in which inside of active sites you can select a particular site and then choose to delete it. So if I was just to find an example site, Project X for example, and just click on delete, it says, are you sure you want to delete it? The site belongs to Microsoft 365 group. Deleting the site will delete the group and its all resources, including the Outlook mailbox and calendar and in Teams channels. You'll have 30 days to restore the group. So I can say yes, delete this, and it's going to delete the SharePoint site elements of this. Then within the deleted sites area, you can see what will appear here. I can see a list of the site names, the URLs, and all the kind of core information that was available inside the active sites. Now, if I was to select on a particular site, I can choose to either permanently delete it or restore this document. As you can see, it says sites are retained for 93 days and then are permanently deleted. But I can choose to restore it, and that will then take the site out of the deleted sites area and put it into the active sites area. So that brings us on to our next topic, which is sharing policies. So what we're talking about here is what we're allowing people to share from our SharePoint Admin Center, and even including external sharing policies. So back in our Admin Center, we can click on the sharing option here. And this is going to show you basically all the settings for controlling the organization's sharing levels within inside of SharePoint and OneDrive as well. So these are actually controlled quite conveniently with these little sliders here. We've got a slider for SharePoint and we've got a slider for OneDrive, and we can actually sort of mix and match the levels that we're willing to share. Now, it's worth mentioning that this is not setting the default necessarily for all SharePoint sites automatically. What we're doing here is we're setting what is the maximum external sharing that we are going to allow. So you would then enable the external sharing, and then you would go to each individual SharePoint site, and you can control at each SharePoint site whether it's got external sharing enabled or not. But this is setting the policy on whether external sharing is allowed full stop. So if you're interested in external sharing, I do have a dedicated video which goes into a lot more detail about external sharing and how to achieve external sharing. So I'm not going to go into too much detail on this right now, but you can see here we can set the different sliders to either anyone, meaning we allow anyone in the world to access the files and folders that we have stored in either OneDrive or SharePoint, and you can use this sort of slider to set that. You can set it whether it's new and existing guests, which means that you can almost create a pool of people that you recognize as guests to your Microsoft 365 tenants, and you can give them access. Existing guests, so they already have to exist, so we can't create any new ones for it. Or we can say only people in our organization, which is the most restrictive option, which means there's no external sharing whatsoever. Further down, we've also got some options here for file and folder links. So we can choose the type of link that's selected by default when a user shares files and folders in SharePoint and OneDrive. So the options here is we can say specific people. So it means that we have to sort of always specify who we want that link to be shared with. We can say only people in our organization, which is the most freeing way of using sharing links. So what we're talking about here is when you go into a document in SharePoint and you click on to share, and then it's going to give you a shareable link, or you can send an email. This is setting the setting to only people in your organization will be able to achieve this, is actually making it a lot easier than saying specific people, because then you have to manually specify those people every single time that you click on that SharePoint button, share button. We've also got the anyone with link, which basically means anyone in the world. So again, this means by default, any shared links which are being created will work for anyone in the world. Now, that is a little bit risky in a certain sense, because you don't know necessarily that everybody's thinking through and whether that content should be shareable to everybody. So typically I see most people using this only people in your organization, because there's a certain level of kind of security there that actually, if you do want it to be externally shareable and it's enabled for external sharing, that person can always change the setting. This is just the default option. You can choose the permission that's selected by default, so whether it's view or editing the document. Again, when you think about the default, it's what is the most commonly used when you're sharing. Is it that you're wanting to share it so someone can read the content, or are you sharing it because someone's going to edit the content? Again, people can always change these. It's just the default, but it's trying to really make sure it's quick and easy for people. Think about, okay, it doesn't take long, it just takes a couple of seconds to maybe change some of these settings. But if that person was having to do that all day, every day, and then doing it multiple times over a year, that's going to add up to a lot of sort of time wasted. You can choose the expiration date. So this is where you can say, actually, the links will only exist for, say, 30 days, and then they will expire. And these links can also give these sort of permissions. So you can set files or folder level permissions as well. There's a couple of other settings down here, so you can choose to show owners the names of the people who viewed their files in OneDrive. You can let site owners choose to display the names of people who viewed the files or pages in SharePoint, as well as use short links for showing files and folders. So these are typically enabled, but again, you can turn these off if you wanted to. It's also worth mentioning under policies, we've also got this access control area. So this is more of a kind of security layers within inside of SharePoint. So this brings me on to my next topic, which is the security controls within inside of SharePoint Admin Centre. So under policies and then access control, we can see here we can do things like managing unmanaged devices. Now, it does require that you have an enterprise mobility and security license, which in this case, my demo, I don't. But this is where you can restrict access from devices that aren't compliant or joined to a specific domain, which is a great first step in securing your SharePoint environment. You can also choose to automatically sign out users from inactive browser sessions, which is part of the idle session sign out. So this is where we can say, actually, if a user hasn't used a SharePoint page for, let's say, for 30 minutes, you can give these users a notice after 5 minutes. You'll sign them out and they won't be able to access. So what this is essentially doing from a security perspective is, let's say, for example, someone's sharing a computer or they're accessed your SharePoint from a home device or even a library computer, for example. If they then walk away from it and they've not signed out, that's a potential security risk that someone could jump on the computer right after them and access some data. So if it's idle and they're not using it, you can automatically force them to sign out of SharePoint. You can also specify network locations. So this will allow access only from specific IP addresses, which you can specify in this box. Again, you're locking it down. So maybe you're saying only can be used in our registered office addresses, for example. And also you can say apps that don't use modern authentication. So you can block access from things like Office 2010 and other apps that don't enforce device-based restrictions through modern authentication models. So you can choose whether you allow access or block access through this. So this is some great additional layers you can add on top of your SharePoint environment from a security perspective. We're about halfway through our video now, so just a quick reminder, if you're enjoying this video, please do subscribe to the channel. If you've got any questions, ask them below. I try and answer all of the questions that you guys are asking. And if you enjoy the video, do like it as well. The next area of the Admin Center is the settings, and this is where you can set some of the high-level settings of SharePoint. Things like what site is going to be used as the main landing site for your intranet and setting it as a home site. Again, I've got a separate video which goes into the details about what is a home site versus a hub site. So go and check that out if you want a bit more information about what a home site is and what it can do. We can also choose whether notifications are coming to our mobile app users, as well as allow users to create and comment on modern pages. So this is something which a lot of people don't like about SharePoint Online, is that by default there is actually a comments box on every single SharePoint page that you create, and a lot of site owners have had to manually turn those comments box off because you don't want the comments there, as it can basically mean that people might expect a response on a page when actually there is no kind of notifications about these kind of things coming through to any particular user. So you can actually go in here and you can turn off, so you can basically disable allowing users to create new modern pages or allowing commenting on modern pages. This one is much more commonly turned off. Site creation. So in here we can choose some options, whether we can control whether users are creating SharePoint sites via APIs, and also where the default sites are created under sites or teams. Again, most people usually go with sites. We can set the default time zone, so you can set the default time zone to your particular region of the world. And actually that's a really useful one to turn on, because you tend to find that, say for example, if you are based in the UK, the default is that it is set to the US time zones, but then you find all of your date formats and all of your kind of sort of date pickers and things like that have the dates the wrong way round for what it is for the UK based format anyway. So then you have to go through and change all the regional settings of each individual site, where it's actually much easier just to update it from day one in this area, so that all sites have the correct time zone for your location. You can also set storage limits. So by default, we can actually set site storage limits. It will be automatic, or you can set it to be manual if you wanted to actually go in and change them yourself. The app launcher tile for stream. So actually you can control the stream settings from inside the SharePoint Admin Centre, which not a lot of people are aware of. But this is where you can set the default destination for the stream app launcher tile, whether it be automatically switch to stream on SharePoint when recommended, or you can force it to go to classic or the new modern version, which actually is run on SharePoint. Again, not a lot of people know that. Then we've got our OneDrive settings. So this is where we can set notifications. So it says here, select this setting to allow users to receive notifications about file activity. Users can turn off the notifications if you wish. So you can choose to, if you're getting a lot of people saying actually you don't want those notifications, you can get them to be turned off automatically. You've also got the ability to set retention on the amount of days to retain deleted users' OneDrives. By default it's 30 days, but you can actually have it up to 3,650 days if you really wanted to. You can set the storage limits as well. By default, it is a terabyte, but you can choose to restrict that if you wanted to. And you can also enable or control the syncing options of OneDrive as well. So use these settings to control syncing of files in OneDrive and SharePoint. So we can say show the sync button on the OneDrive website, or you can choose to disable that if you didn't want them to be able to sync their OneDrive. Allow syncing only on computers joined by specific domains. Again, we can specify an Active Directory domain GUID in here, and we can also block upload of specific file types as well. So if we didn't like people uploading videos or things like that, which might be clogging things up, we might choose to restrict that as a file format type. So that is all the settings that we have inside of our SharePoint Admin Centre. So the next thing to talk about then is the term store inside of the SharePoint Admin Centre. So the term store actually is a way that you can create what we call managed metadata, which is a set of tags that you can then associate to pages or files or folders within inside of your SharePoint document libraries and SharePoint site pages. This can be accessed by clicking on the content services and then clicking on term store on the left hand side. The term store is essentially where you can then create these kind of nested tags in your taxonomy. So for example, under countries, we might have different departments. Then under, say for example, IT, we might have like different labels which sit underneath here. But it just means that you've got a categorized way of tagging things in a very granular way. The best way to kind of describe to get into people's heads how this could work is, say for example you go on a clothes shopping website, and you are looking and you're filtering, it's very rare that you just go on and you just find the product you want. You typically go on and then you might filter. So you might say, for example, I'm looking for men's clothing. So men's clothing is the first option. The option underneath that then is I'm looking for t-shirts, and then that brings me down to then, okay, well, what sizes of t-shirts am I then looking for? So I'm looking for a large t-shirt, and maybe it's a blue large men's t-shirt. And you can see we're slowly refining down a very large set of data to something very specific. Then from maybe say 10,000 results, it's then going to show me say 50 men's t-shirts that it has which are large and blue, for example. So I'm not searching through 10,000 results, I'm only searching for 100 that it has specific to what I'm looking for. But essentially this is where you can come to create your taxonomy, and then you can apply that to specific SharePoint sites. The next area is called our content type gallery. Now, I'm fairly certain this used to be called the content type hub, but it now displays a content type gallery inside of our SharePoint Admin Centre. And essentially what this is for is if you're building out content types, which if you're not aware of what a content type is, essentially it is a set of predefined columns which get applied to either a document library or maybe a page library, which has those columns automatically in place. Now, if you're going and creating content types in a SharePoint site, those content types are only available inside of that one specific site. But actually, it might be a content type you want to apply to all of your SharePoint sites. So rather than going and manually creating it multiple times, which I've seen done by some organizations in the past, actually it's much easier to go into your content type gallery and create it once and then choose to apply that to specific sites. So you can access a content type gallery in here. You can see all the different site content types which have been created, as well as creating your own content type within here, which is where you can specify the name, the description, what type of category does it fall under, is it custom, you inherit the parent content type, and then you would go through the process of adding all the columns that you wanted to, and then at the very end you can choose which SharePoint sites you're then deploying this site to, this content type to, so that it's readily available on all sites, and you've got this centralized content type gallery where you can go back and update the columns or any of the values which sit in that, which then sync back to all the sites which are using that content type. So the next topic I want to discuss in the Admin Centre is the SharePoint migration element of this. So on the left hand side you've got this migration option, and actually this is extending all the time all the different areas that Microsoft are allowing you to migrate your content from. Originally it was things like file shares that you're moving from say a file server into Microsoft 365, SharePoint Online and OneDrive, but now there's all sorts of additional things that it will allow you to migrate from. Things like Box as a third party, Google Workspace, and Ignite, Dropbox, things like that. So these are all third party products which people may have started using. There's a lot of small organizations which start using Google Workspace or Box, for example, which then find that they don't scale very well to being a larger organization, and then they look to Microsoft 365. And actually this area here will actually get you started with that migrational process, and will help you transition from using those third-party tools in getting into your SharePoint online area. You can also look for help and guidance using the SharePoint migration tool if you're migrating from things like SharePoint on-premise 2010, 2013 or 2016. Basically, whatever you're kind of migrating from, there's a good chance it's probably going to fall under one of these categories, and you can get started with the process of migration by using these tools. So you can go into the Get Started area, and it will guide you through everything that you need to know to actually get started with the migrational process. And then finally, we've got the More Features area. So the More Features area is kind of like the catch-all area of all the different kind of little bits and bobs and features that you might want to access or configure about the SharePoint Admin Centre. You can access this on the left-hand side under More Features. And this is where you can get quick access to things like the term store, the user profile database, which actually is really useful actually to get into, because if you can get into here, you can see actually what all of the kind of profiles are of the accounts you've got synced up inside of your SharePoint Admin Center. So if I go into, say, for example, manage user profiles in here, this will show me all the different accounts that exist inside of my SharePoint. It's a total number of about 10 in here. So if I just search for a user, there we go. It's found my account, and I can drill into this and find if say, for example, a very common issue is if the profile image hasn't synced across, because not a lot of people are aware that actually SharePoint has its own user database like this, which is updating from Azure Active Directory and pushing information into it. But sometimes the sync can break down. So sometimes users are reporting things like their profile picture hasn't synced up correctly and things like that. So if you're having that particular issue, please let me know and I can point you in the right direction of how you can resolve that. But there's loads of other reasons why you might want to come in here and take a look at what profile settings and properties are actually being synced through for that particular user. There's a search area in here, so you can actually help users find what they're looking for with SharePoint search. So there's a couple of different configuration options that we can get to from in here. So managing search schemas, things like that. Also managed sort of mapped properties. So if there's things like custom properties that you're mapping across into SharePoint that you're wanting to surface in SharePoint results and things like that, that's what this is the area that you need to be in for looking at all of that. But essentially, I'm not going to go through all of these different areas, but you can see this is a bit of a catch-all area of all the other bits and bobs which may sit underneath your kind of SharePoint admin. Things like info path, so if you want to disable that, classic site collections, again, well, this is actually removed, so it's telling you it's been removed, but there's a load of other bits and bobs it's worth kind of just having a little look through. The main bits that you're probably going to use on a day-to-day basis are listed on the left-hand side here, but I say this is a bit of a catch-all area. If you're going through something which is maybe a bit more of a legacy kind of SharePoint feature, you tend to find that it's inside of here, but most of the day-to-day activity stuff that you'll be using is actually listed as a tab on the left-hand side as well. I hope you enjoyed that video and it was useful to you. If it was, please do like the video, subscribe to my channel and enable alerts for more content which gets released on a weekly basis. If you've got any questions, use the comments feed below. I'll do my best to answer all of your questions. If there's something that you're going through and you're not too sure how to achieve it inside of SharePoint, let me know and I can see what I can do. Maybe even if you've got any suggestions for videos you'd like to see, or any sort of thoughts that are being provoked from this particular video that you would like a follow-up video about, again, let me know in the comments feed and I can see what I can do about that. Thank you very much for watching and look out for future content.